And dear students, dear colleagues, dear interested parties in the hall and outside in the virtual space, I'm very pleased to open the lecture series, Current Perspectives in Social Work. The presentations in this lecture series deal with very fundamental topics in social work, such as integration, security, deservingness, or, as today, the history of social work. However, these lectures now open up new perspectives on these fundamental issues. Questions are asked in new and different ways. The aim of the lecture is not to agree with the answers, but to stimulate reflection and further thought. 7 colleagues from Germany, USA, Canada, and Ireland will give a presentation. Among them are well-known academics, but we will also hear presentation from colleagues who are not yet well-known, and I'm delighted that their presentation with us marks the beginning of an illustrious career. With its fundamental questions, the lecture series is primarily aimed at students, and the speakers are encouraged not so much to give an impressive lectures for other lecturers, but to inspire students for their field of research. All lectures are recorded and put online on YouTube afterwards, so that they can be watched and used for seminars and lectures as well. Only the speakers and moderator can be seen on the camera recording. After the talk, which will be about 50 minutes, participants in the virtual room can ask questions using the question and answer button. Viewers here in the room write their question on the cards at their seat, which I will then transfer to the chat. I would now like to introduce our first speaker. Katherine Lewis is a licensed social worker, a research associate, and a PhD student in history at Case Western Reserve University. Her PhD is on the professionalization of social work in the 19th century Philadelphia, which is also her topic for today. Katherine Lewis will open up a new perspective on the historiography of social work. She will show that the US history of social work, as we also know it in Germany, cannot be reduced to Jane Addams and Mary Richmond, but was also shaped by people from the Black community. With this topic, she not only fits perfectly into the lecture on the history of social work, but also in Black History Month. Welcome to Stuttgart, Katherine Lewis. The stage is now yours.
Thanks, Melanie. That's a great way to describe the purpose of the talk, inspiring the research of social work students, because that's 100% what I'm here to do. And I appreciate the invitation by your students and yourself to speak today about one of my primary passions, that is underrepresented histories of social work. The American social work profession has developed from and with European traditions, and so this talk should be of great interest to anyone invested in the development of social work as a profession. Joyce Bell, in her 2014 book, The Black Power Movement and American Social Work, explored how Black social workers organized within social work institutions like the National Federation of Settlements or the National Conference on Social Welfare to increase representation and address racism in the profession. Bell's goal was to show how the Black Power movement did not end with the radical protests, but became institutionalized as part of a natural lifespan of a revolution. She follows several scholars writing in the 1990s, like Iris Carlton-Linney, who wrote several histories of Black social work pioneers, and Robinia Lawrence Gary, who wrote about the history of social work education for Black people from 1900 to 1930. And Bell was also followed by many more scholars writing today, like Denisha Shepard and Suzanne Pritzker, who also argued that the political nature of Black social work is central to social work history. They, like Kelechi Wright, Courtney Carr, and Becky Aiken, believe that we should assertively recognize Black social work's contribution to their communities and to the profession. My research, as you said, into social work in the 19th century is one way to answer their call for a historical account of social work history that both acknowledges the racism that shaped it and also intervenes Restoring Black social workers and their contributions to our shared profession. In 2018, scholar Crystal Coles recommended a method called, and I'll say it slowly because it's not even an easy word in English, prosopography, which involves examining scant historical records to, quote, raise the voices of those erased in social work history. It involves piecing small details together to develop a collective history of individuals. And prosopography is underutilized in social work history. I'll be pulling social work out of many established historiographies, such as Black power, religious charity, labor, especially women's labor, and women's clubs. And finally, I'll be combining this process with genealogical mapping to show continuity between these different collectives over time. At the end of the presentation, I welcome your questions and your insight as we learn from our respective histories and continue to build an increasingly inter- and transnational perspective on the core challenges of social work today. I will not be covering the wider historiography of U.S. social work in this talk, but you should know 3 things before we continue. Book-length histories of social work tend to reproduce the framing and the structure of Roy Leboeuf's The Professional Altruist, published in 1965. That is, they present social work profession through a functionalist lens, defined by social control, moral authority, and special knowledge. This does not reflect scientific updates to the sociology of professionalization, such as Magali Sarfati Larson's work on monopolies and jurisdiction. The histories themselves downplay discord and diversity within the profession, while also encouraging polarization. For example, settlement versus casework. There's limited or no examination of many times, places, and people where social work happened. And finally, they're about institutions and policies rather than people and relationships. And this to me is the most surprising feature, especially as many histories are written by social workers themselves. In these histories, social workers, with few exceptions, are reduced to archetypes that have changed minimally over the eras. So this talk will be structured chronologically, looking at 3 of the 4 main periods, which you see at the bottom. I'll use my laser pointer. Technology. At the start of each period, I will describe for you the primary people represented in social work histories from this time. This will be a very superficial overview, and it's not the only way to explore representation. For example, we could examine ideologies, such as how social work histories claim maternalist perspectives dominated in the 19th century and feminist in the 20th century, something I'm going to challenge today. Where most historians focused on white institutions' use of scientific philanthropism for social control, U.S. social workers themselves have always had different ideas about how to be a social worker. As historian James Levy said in 1978, quote, "Some people envisioned a grand liberation, others a breakdown of morality and authority. Should social workers help clients fit into a modern society, or should they be members of the communities themselves, organizing their peers to reform? Are both social workers, are both professionals?" Without examining the boundaries of social work, we won't be able to answer these questions. So let's look at some of the gaps in our history. To examine the underrepresented, we must first redefine the profession. Going back before 1870 and resisting polarized narratives, e.g. solely triumphant or degrading ones. We need to seek out diversity, especially rural, Southern USA, Black, non-degreed, Indigenous, or non-institutional social work. We need to focus, most importantly, on people and their relationships, exploring intersections between gender, class, race, and religion, and identify structures that amplify and constrain people's choices. It's worth noting that social work has been equal parts emancipatory and oppressive. As scholar Margaret Jacobs wrote in 2009, of social workers removing Indigenous children from their homes during the social work-led Americanization movement, quote, intimate spaces became small theaters of colonialism where colonial scripts were produced and performed. The profession has admittedly grown in part because of its adoption by corporations and governments as a tool of social control. But today, I specifically share emancipatory examples to show that despite the competing demands made on social workers by society, we're not made to be tools of oppression. To that end, I'll show you how even in northern USA cities, social work started professionalizing before 1870 as a part of an abolitionist or anti-slavery, anti-racist, feminist, and anti-poverty organizing. Social work became a profession because an increasing number of people needed protection from the consequences of a warmongering, imperialist, capitalist, industrial society, aka starvation, abuse, addiction, lack of shelter, and illness. In the deeply patriarchal early republic, both women and men performed social work. But while men did it as a part of a respectable, waged, professionalized work like ministry or medicine, women were unwaged volunteers who could leverage their emotional intelligence and social powers to gain access to the most intimate and private of spaces. Social work, you see, started out as mixed gender and multiracial, but became increasingly segregated during this period due to an increased interest in the classification of people by essentialist or embodied traits of gender and race. Between the 1870s and 1940s, social work continued to professionalize within and because of Black communities, despite increasingly oppressive laws and racist institutional practices. So today I'll be referring to examples of Black social workers, but scholars have also identified examples from Indigenous and Hispanic social work, and I'll provide links to those at the end of the lecture. After World War II, Black social workers continue to shape and lead modern social work practices that define us as a profession. And by the end, I hope you see, American social work history is Black history. So let's begin. On the screen is a map which shows the USA population and railways in 1850. America remained an agricultural economy well into the 19th century, although increased migration and industrialization contributed to its urbanization. In the British colony of America, social work was characterized by the Lady Bountiful stereotype of wealthy women entering poor homes to provide alms. But graduate educated men were also actively involved in providing aid during this time. In the 18th and 19th centuries, these friendly visitors organized themselves into benevolent societies. They labored, usually unpaid, in activities we would immediately recognize as social work today. They brokered education, jobs, they fundraised and distributed resources, managed houses and community services, advocated with other professionals, influenced social policy and legislation, and sometimes they even kept case records. The case examples in this section I'll focus on are from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, covering the decades between the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. So Philadelphia was the capital of the British Pennsylvania colony and served as a central meeting place of the founders of the United States of America. It was colonized by Quakers, notably William Penn, who received a charter from the British king to occupy the indigenous lands of the Lenape tribe. From the start, it was a leader in abolitionist ideology, organizing the first protests of the Atlantic slave trade in 1688. This map is Philadelphia in 1819, which shows the carefully planned city center next to the river. Philadelphia, while known first for its industry and shipbuilding, was, like most American cities, dependent on Pennsylvania's agriculture, which supported a range of smaller industries and commercial establishments, as shown in the next slide. Laborers, shown in red, helped build the expanding city. Merchants even those with the popular abolitionist ideology earned their livelihood in an expanding international market for luxury goods that depended on the Atlantic slave trade. Proximity to Market Street was proportional to your proximity to wealth, and among each of these groups were free Black people. Between 1790 and 1860, the population of free Black people in the United States increased 8.3 times. In Philadelphia, free Black people comprised about 5% of the total city population in 1790. This proportion tripled to 9% just 10 years later. Black households were larger than white households. They tended to congregate near other Black people, as shown by the white circles, usually renting properties from Quakers. By 1860, 1 in 4 Black households were run by women, as opposed to 1 in 10 white households. In many areas of the US, the gathering of more than 5 Black people was prohibited, except for churches. So churches became a safe way of organizing, especially in the South. Philadelphia had less legal restrictions, but being a major port for the trafficking of enslaved Africans, there were plenty of unsafe places for Black people to gather. The Free African Society, founded in 1787, was non-denominational at first, but closely followed Quaker practices. You can see in the memorial plaque on the right that the society is remembered chiefly for 2 of its founders, Richard Allen and Absalom Jones, and for its role in fostering, quote, identity, leadership, and unity among Blacks. The society collected dues from its members and demanded members adhere to specific moral standards. In return, it provided financial support, like payments for burials, aid to widows, apprenticeships for children, school tuition, and even unemployment and sick leave. Although the society didn't last long, it inspired hundreds of mutual aid societies in Philadelphia. The Free African Society and the subsequent activities of its members illustrate the personal and collective power of free Black people in Philadelphia society. They saw a need for and a benefit of providing mutual support to other Black people, especially women and children, that transcended religious unity. Although Black women were a critical part of delivering services in the Free African Society, they, like white women, were often explicitly prohibited from speaking in male-dominated spaces. Many social services were segregated even when the founders and members were not, such as the Shelter for Colored Orphans, established in 1822 by the Society of Friends. It opened in response to structural racism. A disproportionate number of children in the almshouses were Black, because it was even more difficult for Black women to earn a living wage to care for them. Many abandoned, separated, or divorced Black women reported their designation as widows in the 1850 census, because being a widow was the primary descriptor at this time for qualifying for aid. It was unlikely to be seen as fraud, however, because most state laws and social institutions in Philadelphia sorted women into those with a responsible fiscal and social authority figure, aka a father, a brother, husband, or even a religious community. And those, as the Quakers say, without friends. Most women in this time were unable to provide for themselves or their children on women's wages alone. This created an increasingly intense need for social structures to fill the gaps left by the people controlling the resources, in this case, mostly white men. Thus, this period is full of examples where people disenfranchised and made vulnerable by the dominant power structures created their own, based on principles of mutual aid to provide a form of social insurance against the horrors of society. Members engaged in contractual, benevolent, socially prestigious, goal-directed services to clients, using their autonomous intellectual authority in their proprietary domain. This is professional social work. But most importantly, they organized with others to safeguard their autonomy and their monopoly over their practice. In Philadelphia by the 1840s, they created a market, a literal market for social work, which was racialized and gendered from the start. The Female Literary Association, founded in 1831, was one example of a society that enabled Black women to organize their social work. At a time when women, especially Black women, were allowed to be present but not speak in mixed societies, the Female Literary Association was a space where they could participate as intellectual equals, sharing their writings anonymously with each other for peer review and group discussion. It organized and prepared them for social work activities in other spheres. And this was not entirely resistance. The association and its members had the moral support of many powerful men. William Lloyd Garrison, a famous abolitionist who ran key anti-slavery and anti-racist newspapers, wrote to Secretary Sarah Douglas, shown at the bottom right, quote, "Most fervently do I bid you, as a society, Godspeed. Approach in your conduct as near to the angels of heaven as possible, or rather be ye perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. My hopes for the elevation of your race are mainly centered upon you and others of your sex." Garrison's words reflected the growing dependence on women, particularly Black women, to reshape society. Indeed, angels would be an image adhering to social work and other women's work well into the 20th century. But not everyone agreed women had a place next to men in the delivery of social services or the leadership of social reform. For example, women were not allowed to be members of the New Philadelphia Abolitionist Society, so they started their own, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. Black and white women organized it together, supported by a Black man who taught them parliamentary procedures. The founders were acutely aware that the US law classed women, Black people, and mentally disabled people together as subordinates to and dependents on white men. Organizing together felt like a necessity to achieve their aims to end not only slavery, but also racial prejudice. Their activities from 1833 to 1870 look similar to what you see in settlement houses later in the 19th century, probably because one of their members, Sarah Pugh, was Florence Kelley's aunt. Members performed social science research, collecting and publishing information on the truth of free Black people to counter racist allegations. They opened a school for Black children. Eventually, they boycotted products produced by slavery. They were advocates for reform, disseminating abolitionist papers and materials, fundraising for national associations, and sewing or selling goods with anti-slavery mottos or designs, as shown as the bottom left of the slide. They solicited signatures for petitions to government. They helped organize the National Convention. And most importantly, they encouraged racial desegregation through intentional public and private social intermixing. To these women, the political was personal, and their interventions were deeply personal too. Social work, as a profession, had boundaries which crossed over a range of socially validated roles for women in the 19th century: teaching, ministering, advocacy, and even mothering. One wealthy Black woman, Harriet Fortin Purvis, shown at the top left, married in 1832 to a Moroccan man. Her wedding, with its large interracial attendee list, drew significant attention in Philadelphia, and I have no doubt that Purvis intended that. Her leadership in nonviolent resistance, coupled with her advocacy with city leaders, led to the eventual desegregation of streetcars in Philadelphia. But despite all of the women's successes, the men of the Abolitionist Society, by majority vote, still did not allow women to have a formal voice via representation in the national conferences. Moreover, other white men rioted, burning down a meeting place in response to the interracial activities of the female society. But this simply strengthened the personal and professional bonds between the women, who developed plans for their own safety so they could continue the work. It's difficult to look at this archived evidence and relegate these women to simply friendly visitors or even kind-hearted Christians. They were highly organized, developing their services in response to community needs. In solidarity with different ideologies, races, and religions, their practices gave birth to many similar institutions operating in Philadelphia during and after the Civil War. Their husbands' and fathers' wages, yes, combined with their own education and personal experiences, enabled them to professionalize social work in Philadelphia. Moreover, they did this all despite the patriarchal constraints which prevented them access to government, university education, or even doing business with men. So the Free African Society targets were individuals and families, aka casework. And the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society targeted social and legal structures, community practice. But the professionalization process for both of them was the same, and social workers did not see boundaries between the two types of social work. So as we move into this era of charity organizations and settlement houses, I want you to keep in mind the foundation for social work I've just described. New map, US population of railways, but this time 1900s. So when we begin in the 1870s, we see a new America post-Civil War. Railroads extended colonizing efforts further into the US. More states joined the Union. A legal system protected and mediated between property owners. And there were state variations, but mostly centered on intense individualism and racism, with policies of separate but equal in the North and Jim Crow laws of segregation in the South. From the perspective of US histories of social work, this is probably a more accurate map because it explains their focus on northern urban industrial areas where white immigrants lived. The wealthy, being predominantly white immigrants or children of immigrants themselves, preferentially funded services for white people, even in communities with majority Black people. With a history of interracial cooperation and community building, white people received more and better support from social institutions. And social work as a profession played a pivotal role in enforcing these oppressive structures in this period. As we move later into the 19th century, we start to see PhD-educated Black men, particularly in the South. Women social workers, now Catholic and Jewish as well as Protestant, begin to draw wages from charities, hospitals, clinics, corporations, or even the state. White, graduate-educated men continue to hold the leadership positions. Most social workers received ad hoc training on the job. Some attended for-profit conferences or completed certificates for curriculums facilitated by their employer. And a few well-educated people of means obtained one of the new master's degrees. There were racial inequalities in who had access to education because Southern institutions were white only and Northern institutions rarely made room for Black students. As educated people had the closest proximity to decision-making around the distribution of resources, this amplified personal prejudices, meaning less resources for people who are not perceived as model white citizens. And that obsession with classification that I mentioned earlier became a formal scientific theory, shaping both laws, institutions, and even behaviors. Many of the first master's degree social workers, for example, who then became leaders of social work programs, were first research staff for the eugenics movement. Eugenicism transformed racism beyond colorism and classism to biological, medical, even psychological theories. It affected every institution and community. More Black people, more Black children were diagnosed as idiots or feeble-minded. More Black men were incarcerated. More Black people were prevented from earning fair, equitable wages. More Black people died, younger and more often than white people. Faced with this reality, Southern-born Black women moved to northern cities in greater numbers for education and work. They were nurses, school teachers, hairdressers, maids, retail workers, even prostitutes. And whether paid for it or not, almost all did social work, trained from birth to uplift the Black community. Historian Stephanie Shaw, in her 1996 book, What a Woman Ought to Be and Do, Black Professional Women Workers During the Jim Crow Era, describes in detail how Black women in this period responded to the structural racism as leaders in their communities. While social histories often sidelined Black women professionals in particular, as a confused subtype of white women or Black man professionals. Black communities were not at all confused about who Black women were. The construction of gender in the Black community encouraged Black women to become expert leaders in the development of a healthy Black identity and a Black community. And I want to examine 4 such women whose labor evolved not as handouts from white women's professionalization, but from the rich history of social work described in the first half of my talk. Furthermore, I will show how their work continued to modernize social work practice. But first, let's look at the legacy of the Northern Church as it extended its social work into the South via mission work. One member of the Female Literary Association, Anne Purvis's niece, Charlotte Fortin Grimke, pictured at the bottom right, was the daughter of a mixed-race woman from Northern Carolina, Edith Wood, who began her life enslaved. Grimke attended a white school in Salem, Massachusetts, and moved throughout Massachusetts, Philadelphia, and South Carolina, helping to integrate the abolition movement between the northern and southern states. She brought key information about the lives and needs of Southern Black children into northern cities as a school teacher in the Port Royal experiment. Grimke eventually moved to Washington, D.C. and married, remaining active in civil rights movements, and later helped found the National Association of Colored Women. After the Civil War ended in 1865, though, churches, especially Black churches, took on the task of reconstruction in the South through mission work that looked very similar to Purvis and Grimke's social work. Indeed, the very societies and social work I described in the first half of my talk were the models for subsequent mission work in the South. The mission work and institutional church movement preceded the settlement movement, which began in 1884 and came to America soon after. Unlike the settlement movement, it centered Christian, often Protestant worship, but otherwise involved many of the same activities in community building and casework. The Calhoun School and Settlement, for example, was based on Hampton and Tuskegee Institutes. Besides a church, it offered a school for Black youth, sociological studies of the community, conferences for farmers and mothers, teacher training, a medical mission, and agricultural fairs. Historians of the settlement movement describe these missions as being based on the English example of Toynbee Hall, but scholar Robert Luker noted, quote, capable contemporary observers saw missions as precursors to the settlement house movement. White people played a significant role in the founding of both missions and settlements, but the success of the rural Southern missions depended entirely on the Black community members taking an active part in leading the community and its services. Janie Barrett, born in Georgia, was raised and educated in a white household where her formerly enslaved mother was employed. Her mother's employers wanted to adopt her and send her to a northern school to live with all the privileges of being coded as white. Instead, her mother sent her to live in the Hampton Institute in Virginia, Barrett's first experience of being Black amongst Black people. She became a teacher and married another Hampton Institute graduate. And in the spirit of the Institute, she devoted herself to providing services from her home in Virginia to women and girls. In 1890, she opened the Locust Street Social Settlement. Like a lot of mission work operating in the South at this time, Locust Street provided education, healthcare, agricultural conferences, mother meetings, temporary housing, daycare, and also distribution of coal and food. By 1910, 11 cities in America had Black settlement houses. Philadelphia had 3. And although the Philadelphia ones adopted the settlement name, they were actually based on the religious missions based out of Philadelphia and eventually merged with other institutions managed by Quaker women. Like prior societies, Philadelphia mission/settlement workers also undertook social science studies of Black communities, but their services modernized with the times. They offered training in trades, a cooperative meal purchasing plan for school children, a medical dispensary, a visiting nurse, and a savings program, all of which was rooted in services provided by Philadelphian social workers since the 19th century. Like other northern cities, Philadelphia had other white settlement houses, History has shown us that the people who benefited the most from those white institutions were not the clients, but the white workers themselves, who developed a political acumen and a network that positioned them into powerful roles advising the government. Success looked very different in the Black communities, the Black missions in the South, who measured it by people it helped, people who became active members and leaders themselves, building expertise and creating opportunities to perform the same mutual aid in other neighborhoods, like Barrett. We're going to look at another Hampton Institute graduate in our next case study who took the mission movement back north. She's one of many Black club women who founded social service programs for Black women at this time. Jane Edna Hunter was a Black woman who started her career as a nurse in the American South before moving to Cleveland with friends in search of higher wages. Like women in the previous century, Hunter and her friends were targeted by a common human trafficking scam, where slick agents recruited migrant women with the promise of good jobs and housing that turned out to be brothels and forced sex work. Hunter was one of only 2 Black nurses in Cleveland at the time and struggled to get a job. Her housing options were unsafe or unaffordable, and there were very few respectable places she could hang out with her friends. So, like the Black social workers before her, when faced with dire living conditions, she turned to mutual aid, community organizing, and casework. She founded the Working Girls Home Association, which collected dues in exchange for support in securing employment, safe housing, and respectable recreation for migrant Black women like herself. It eventually incorporated as a settlement house called Phyllis Wheatley Association, which started as a 23-room boarding house, but eventually became the 88-room apartment building with attached recreation center shown in the bottom of the slide. There was significant resistance from the well-established Black community in Cleveland at first. Black leaders had a strong integrationist objective and felt that Black-only housing would contribute to the segregation that already existed in Cleveland. But the local YWCA didn't take Black women. So white philanthropists agreed to fund Hunter as long as she appointed white women to the board. The success of the association quickly dissipated the discord. Hunter's reputation for training highly employable Black women grew. The Phyllis Wheatley Association still exists today, although it's a neighborhood center rather than housing, upholding its original mission through the provision of scholarships to young Black women. So historians of Black American professionals have shown that in whatever roles they take on, many Black women also performed social work. By virtue of the racism and economic marginalization they experienced in their personal lives, Black women could not maintain the distance between themselves and their clients that white social workers strived for, nor did they want to in most cases. Black social workers empowered their clients through community work that was deeply linked to race and class. The academic and bureaucratic elites and their historians may not have recognized their labor, but their communities certainly did, with these Black women holding significant power and prestige as a result of their expertise and service. Moreover, the history of their social work was not subordinate to white institutions, but had a lineage of its own. And we can trace it quite literally north and south and north again. In the next case study, we're going to leave the orbit of America entirely. My final example for this period is Thyra J. Edwards, a school teacher in Houston, Texas. For her, the war was not across the pond, as many Americans saw World War I, but right outside her door, as tensions over segregation culminated in violence between the white Houston police and a Black Army regiment guarding a nearby base. Not long after this, Edwards left teaching to work as a family visitor with Houston Social Services, moving the next year to Indiana with her sister. While working as a social worker, Edwards eventually completed her formal education at Chicago School of Civics and Philanthropy. Her jobs consisted of a variety of positions that supported and promoted Black education, professionals, and businesses. In the late 1920s, however, her perspective shifted away from capitalism towards labor organizing. She traveled in Europe, completing more education, this time on peacemaking at a labor college in Denmark. The latter was primarily male Danish and German students, many cautiously fleeing growing tensions in their home country. Edwards studied German and gathered research on Danish institutions, which she sent back to the US for publication in the Chicago Defender, a Black newspaper, as well as other sources. Edwards found friends in an international network of Black American activists and German Jewish refugees. The appetite in Europe to learn from Edwards' experience as a Black woman was huge, with many Danes having never seen a Black woman before. And it was clear that Edwards had a preference for what she called the, quote, detached curiosity of the European gaze compared to the, quote, hostile glares of the white Americans. She continued to travel extensively in Europe, giving lectures, working with refugees, and ultimately developing a significant link between American and European social work, all as an unaffiliated, unmarried Black woman. The 1930s was when professional social work schools were starting to appear in Europe. And then the first International Conference on Social Work was in Paris in 1928. There was a significant exchange between America and Europe. But a lot of the focus of this exchange was within the settlement movement or psychiatric casework, with white women at the forefront. Like in America, white social workers were used by different European political regimes to support social control. Edwards challenged that narrative quite literally in her tours of Europe. And as a Black radical social worker, Edwards found ideological support most in Spain and in Soviet Union, where she saw how socialism could address the problems of poverty and inequality. Growing up amidst several wars, she was openly anti-fascist, helping to organize support for victims of the Spanish Civil War and eventually founding a Jewish childcare program in Rome for Holocaust victims after World War II. Scholar Greg Andrews described Edwards as growing to see America as, quote, part of the larger struggle against fascism, colonialism, and imperialism. Edwards herself was fed up with what she called, quote, piddling little victories. First Negro here, only Negro there, etc. She had much grander social changes in mind for Black people, and these involved explicit changes to the economy. Unfortunately, she died from cancer in 1953, too soon to see her dreams realized. But her international social work, connecting the American Black experience with European anti-fascist labor movements, provided invaluable insights to Black Americans at home in Chicago who read her articles. And people did read her articles. In 1938, The Informer, a Black newspaper in Houston, featured a large photograph of Edwards on its front page, calling her the, quote, spirit of womanhood. So America was much changed during and by the World Wars and the Great Depression. Anti-poverty social support shifted from charitable organizations to more state and federal welfare. Many of our behavioral health systems owe their origins to the hygiene movement and military health programs, which championed psychological testing and established an epidemiological model for diagnosing and surveilling health in the population. Social work, too, became adopted by the state. In the 1950s, it consolidated its professional jurisdiction as a unified national professional organization, the National Association of Social Workers. They began the long fight for mental health funding through state licensing laws and won the right to supervise themselves. In the world of white institutions, at least, they were on their way to being an autonomous profession. In the 20th century, more women, especially Black and Indigenous women, had PhDs. The roots to social work solidified somewhat through early accreditation of social work master's programs. But for many people like Edwards, no degree is needed to start doing social work for the state. Even today in the 21st century, many people doing social work are not licensed or even degreed social workers. The health and social care economy simply couldn't support itself without peer support workers or therapeutic behavior specialists, both of whom have their own billing codes, providing agencies with far cheaper labor, for much greater funding. So in this final section, I'll highlight the contributions of two Black women whose work has directly shaped what social work looks like for those of us training in the 21st century. Elaine Pinder-Hughes, in her own words, backed into social work because she, quote, didn't want to be a teacher and didn't want to be a nurse. The only two jobs she perceived available to women in that time. She completed her MSW at Columbia University in 1948, writing a thesis on Black identity and parenting before immediately retiring to become a parent. Depressed, by her own words, and thirsty to use her mind again, Pinder-Hughes started volunteering in the League of Women Voters and eventually returned to practice in a child guidance clinic, supporting other depressed mothers. In child guidance clinics, psychiatrists or psychologists worked with the child using a psychoanalytic model, and social workers supported the mothers. Fathers were rarely involved. Pinder-Hughes was hired by an all-white clinic specifically to support the expansion of services into the Black community that surrounded the clinic. Her colleagues didn't think Black families would be able to engage in psychoanalytic therapy. So when they did, the colleagues pathologized Black family anger. Pinder-Hughes resisted this and asked her colleagues to consider rage as a natural response to oppression. As she recruited her white colleagues to her point of view, the team began dialoguing directly about race. Quote, there was a lot of pain, Pinder-Hughes said. And that's when I first began to think about power as a dynamic in a social group. Pinder-Hughes observed that, quote, when people who have power begin to lose it, begin to feel threatened, they feel powerless. She eventually became a clinical director of a large counseling agency in the 1960s and a professor of social work at Boston College in 1975. As well as being a skilled clinician, she actively addressed, quote, pain, power, and privilege within her own social work departments, seeing this as central to her core values and personal identity as a Black woman. Pinder-Hughes applied her discovery of dynamics and power into her work with families, heralding a paradigm shift in family therapy that was more than practitioners beginning to simply, quote, examine the ways in which both social and family dynamics might influence the child's psychological difficulties, as described in a 2010 family therapy history textbook chapter. Those social and family dynamics were racialization, gender construction, sexism, and racism. The importance of Black power in provoking a paradigm shift in child guidance clinics was stripped from the origin story of family therapy by scholars intent on providing an objective, universal, intellectual history for their discipline. Barbara Bryant Solomon grew up in the 1940s and 50s in a segregated Houston, Texas, attending the Wesley African Methodist Episcopalian Church. And from the start, she wanted to be a psychiatrist, helping people to manage their lives. But at Howard University, she struggled physically with the pre-medical training required for psychiatry, so she shifted to psychology, but was dissatisfied by the experimental nature of it. In school breaks, she volunteered with city youth in her hometown. She took an introductory course in social work in her senior year, and Solomon found she liked what she heard. She began her master's in social welfare at UC Berkeley at the age of 19, specializing in medical social work. She was one of 2 minority students out of 100 students in her class. After graduation, she started work at the Veterans Administration Hospital in 1958, supervising social work students, eventually moving back to California to complete her PhD and become a social work professor at the University of Southern California, where she obtained tenure in 3 years, so short, and ended her career as a vice provost. Solomon practiced and published in a renaissance of Black scholarship and Black power organizing, when Black clinicians were proposing dynamic models of social determinants of health that interrogated oppressive structures and behaviors. Her own research was inspired by her clinical work. Although trained in a Freudian school, Solomon felt strongly that building a therapeutic relationship was essential to having any influence over clients. But how did people do this in a cross-cultural encounter? Solomon's training in culture was limited to white cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead's work in Samoa, not the inner city of America. In her own words, she argued, quote, "We had to think more closely about what we were experiencing in our contemporary lives." So when she was asked to teach a course on social work in the Black community, Solomon acknowledged her lack of training in articulating Black social work and took her students out of the classroom into the Black community itself. And what they learned there was that social work in Black communities by white institutions had stripped Black social work of the mutuality of its practice. Students saw clients were hungry, so the students proposed meals on wheels, but clients wanted groceries so they could prepare their own meals. Moreover, the students saw how supposedly helpful institutions like schools, courts, hospitals, and welfare services rendered Black people vulnerable simply for being Black. But rather than rejecting clinical social work in favor of community practice, as many reform-minded social workers did at this time, Solomon saw an opportunity to reframe clinical social work so that it encompassed what I've hopefully demonstrated to you today. That is, what American Black people, especially women, have been doing in Black communities all along. Effective, evidence-based social work that used empowering relationships and mutual aid to build strong, revolutionary even, collectives that maximize their ability to emancipate themselves from oppressive, neglectful, and abusive structures. Solomon's translation of Black empowerment into clinical social work was immediately well received by social work colleagues. In her writing, Solomon emphasized the complexity and the diversity within the Black community, and she called on her colleagues to take an intersectional approach to social work that considered class and gender alongside race. Her theory was situated completely in the Black Power movement and Black social work history, but she wrote with the white social worker in mind, including exercises in supporting a change in practice. Perhaps because of that, Solomon's empowerment theory was rapidly stripped of race, demonstrated most clearly by Solomon's 1987 article titled simply Empowerment, Social Work in Oppressed Communities. So Douglas, Purvis, Grimke, Barrett, Hunter, Edwards, Pinder Hughes, and Solomon all were subject to sexism and racism, but they were not merely victims of oppression or objects of white charity. In the words of historian Erlene Stetson, quote, "Too often the apparent powerlessness of a group obscures its real power." Thanks to the labor of these women, Black power became institutionalized within the fabric of social work practice itself. And this started not in the civil rights movements of the mid-20th century, nor even in the rise of social science expertise in the 1870s, but at least as far back as Black people of the Free African Society, who, as children coming of age in the wake of a Revolutionary War, saw the Declaration of Independence as a call to arms in designing a community which protected the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, not of all people, but at least those willing to live, according to the preamble of the Free African Society, a quote, orderly and sober life in order to support each other. Remember, history is never as noble as we would like. Thank you. And I have a lot of references if you need to. For each of the women I speak about today, there are dozens more examples in the archive ready to meet you.
The applause is yours.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Katherine. I was really impressed and was very silent here because I think these were very interesting histories for all of us. So, but before chit-chatting with you, I would like to open the audience. Maybe you have any question to Katherine. Maybe there's something you haven't understood. You can write it on the cards and I will type it into the chat. But maybe outside in the audience, in the virtual room, there are also person who want to ask something. So just use the F and A button. Actually, if no one has a question yet, I will have a question because you are writing another history of social work in America. So the first question I have was, what was the biggest surprise in your research? Because you discovered so much new things, but maybe there were one or two things which were especially surprising?
That's a great question. So what was something that has surprised me in my dissertation research or the research for this? Well, first, my dissertation started as a different topic, and it was my interest in the history of social work and finding out about a 19th century institution called the Rogin Society, that they kept case records. And that defied the history, which said that scientific forms of social work didn't start until the 1870s with the rise of universities. And so it's like, okay, that's not true. For these women in this time, in this place, at least, they organized themselves very professionally, according to later definitions of professionalism. And one of those was case notes, that they were doing case notes. They were thinking scientifically about their clients and performing services that encompass very, very immediately identifiable forms of social work. So it made me question, okay, was this just a single practice in a single place, or was this happening in lots of other spaces? And as I began to investigate more into Philadelphia and into other places and into other unrepresented communities, I noticed, hey, wait a second, this challenges the boundaries of social work that were created in that time. And so I know that it was something worth sharing.
There's a comment in the chat. Someone liked your talk very much. Yes. Are there maybe any other questions? We will wait because people are writing still. But Katherine,
Yeah.
maybe as you're writing another history of social work in the USA, how is this history you are writing recognized by other social workers or the scientific community?
I've had a couple opportunities now to sort of talk about this. What I would say is the published history, like right now, there's a lot of papers demanding a change. So for as many histories there are of social work, which is not many, there are articles from people saying it's not enough, that this narrative doesn't represent us. It doesn't help us to articulate who we are today and where we want to be as a profession. A lot of that's coming from within the Black community. And so when I, for example, attended a discussion group for graduate students, supported by the American History Association, specifically looking at the history of social work and social welfare, there were 30 plus graduate students in the room, and I would say 98% of them were Black or Indigenous or people of color, and only one of them was doing their PhD in history. The rest of them were doing their PhDs in social work, and the PhD in history was obviously me. So a lot of the sentiment is we need someone to do this work. Please do this work. That's what the papers all say. So I am doing this work, but I think that this is not enough, just me. And so my commitment really is to help train other social workers in doing historical research and incorporating that into their models and the papers that they write as a valid way of sort of adding to what social work research looks like today. And so I think that appetite is huge. And so I'm getting a very positive reception. Whether that will be supported by the institutions themselves, we know that change is slow and that the appetite change for the collective people maybe happens before institutions start to change. But I do see a shift. And I do think that we'll start to see more histories like Chapman and Withers, who provide an alternative or a more radical social work history, appear as more of us get into the archives and show what social work looked like in these different periods or communities.
Thank you very much. I would need a little bit of technical help because I can't write questions into the box. Or I don't know how. Ja. Jetzt ist nicht ein Chat, das ist ja eigentlich bei FAQ. But how can I write here? So we have a, yeah. Anyway, you can hear us, so I will just.
Yeah, verbally is
So
fine.
this is one question from a student in the room. He said we heard a lot about Black history and history from women, but are there also histories from indigenous people?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me, which actually slipped to the next slide. So much of the work around Indigenous social work history is actually coming out of Canada right now, which I'm seeing a lot of impressive collective appetite for understanding what it looks like, what Indigenous social work is, and how it took place within Canada in particular. So you'll see here at the right, there's a couple different references that speak specifically to that group. There are some more examples. What's worth noting, though, is, and this is partly a critique of our scientific values and the paradigm around publishing, is Indigenous research looks differently and organizes itself differently in a much more collective manner than some of the sort of individualized post-positivist, like traditional American colonial Western research. So the work that's being done, if you look just at publications, it's not representative. You will need to go into other spaces to really get a full appreciation of what is taking place within those communities. So I can't easily cite it here, but I can promise you that if you go to these specific scholars and see sort of the communities they're embedded in, that's where that scholarship is taking place as a part of a dialogue and a community conversation within Indigenous traditions. And you see mixes of that also within Hispanic social work history, which is much more intersectional in the sense of historical research. The migration and colonialism in like Southern America, Latin America, and even up into United States combines Indigenous history with Black history and imperialist history all in the same way. And it gets to be quite complex, but really, really rich, probably older in some sense than some of the social work history in the Black community that we're seeing in the publications. But they're easy to miss because so much of the scholarship, as you see, in particular, is around Black social work. And that's in part just due to a numbers game. But yeah, I'm happy to share this slide and you can have a look.
Okay. Another question. Are there any current POC pioneers in your social work?
I'm not sure when you say POC, do you mean people of color, like Black or brown or other? Okay. And what do you mean by current? Do you mean like alive
Today?
and publishing today?
Yes.
Because Pinder Hughes and Solomon are fairly current in the sense that the contributions they made to our social work research and our paradigm, the way we work, we're still using it. I'm guessing you've probably learned about empowerment as a structure or as a way of working in social work. And certainly some of the dynamics of power and relationships have also informed some of the works we do, particularly in community practice, but also clinical work. I think, you don't have to step very far to see strong Black leaders. For example, my school, our dean is a Black man from Canada who researches violence in the Black communities. I personally was trained, my clinical social work trainer, by a wonderful Black woman who takes a psychoanalytic approach. And so I think in social work schools, we've come a long way, but not quite there yet. in terms of representation. I know that a lot of the conversations right now is less about who the people are, who the pioneers are, and more around how can we develop a curriculum that reflects our rich history and meets the needs of social workers and clients today. And that very much in America centers race, because that is still a problem in America, racism. And as we have these complex conversations in social work school about really contemporary legislation around women's bodies and around still segregation and the history and legacy of segregation, it's right in the forefront. So representation and having pioneers and leaders isn't the only answer. we need to change the institutions and structures too. And that requires a lot of more cooperation and solidarity today than perhaps we've had, but something we've had in the past. In the 19th century, for example, that was very effective in shifting legislation and changing institutions. We just need to bring that a little bit back. So I see a question, an anonymous one on the.
There is one in the question and answer box. Maybe you can answer that.
Yeah, and I'll answer verbally if that's okay. But if you need me to summarize. So the question box asks, how did social work look like for the Black community in the early stages? So I'm guessing you mean like even the colonial period maybe, or early republic, so before the Civil War. And then it says, what specific tasks did they do? It's worth noting that I'm creating an artificial boundary. So we're drawing a line saying that the revolution, the creation of the United States of America, we're going to look at things after that. But the legacy of Black social work goes further back than that. I also did not address what it looked like in enslaved Black communities, but we know there's scholarship available to show the roles that, for example, Black women had as healers, as providing similar social work services that we would see today, some emotional support of each other, some healing work, a lot of solidarity building, some ritual development, gaining access to resources, caring for youth and older people. So the things I describe in the 18th century and the 19th century, we could easily pull from other areas and other spaces. And the religions affecting and shaping how those practices looked like were also greater in variety too. So Vodun, for example, coming from Africa and then through Haiti and Central America. So it's hard to say when you say, like, what does it look like? Because the Black communities in Philadelphia versus, say, Southern Virginia looked very different, particularly whether they were free or enslaved. I think that social work looked very similar to what we do today. Not having a wage, we often see that as it's not professional work. But I think if you look at their actual activities, the kind of publications they were producing for each other, leaflets, other handouts, how they organized with other people doing that work to create a sort of monopoly and strengthen their bargaining power with the state. All of those structures are same as what we see today. And so some of those specific tasks involve things like casework, like organizing resources and brokering resources for specific people in need, assessing them. They even, I mentioned certain societies, they even thought about the social determinants for poverty and for other things. So they were doing research. It wasn't published in peer-reviewed journals, and it didn't take place within a university, but they were doing all of that work to improve their practice. Everything you see in the competencies of what a social worker is, supporting families, evaluating your own work, I can see evidence of that in the archives for these people. So I hope that explains it. I think that if you look at the resources I've shared here, a lot of them are focused on single pioneers. And what they do is they go into much greater detail about their day-to-day lives, what sort of tasks they do in that time period. And they can give a sort of a better picture of those individuals. But as a historian on the outside looking at all of these, I can say that the pattern is very similar, that you're following the same sort of structure of a profession throughout this period up to today.
Thank you. So we have still some other questions from the students, a little bit of work for you to do. And the first is about charity organization. And the question is, were there female headmasters in institutions?
So yes, and I'm not sure whether you're speaking to social work programs or to schools, and I will answer to both. So yes, especially in Philadelphia, which was more feminist than other cities, there was, in the middle of the 19th century, part of the push for social reform was an acknowledgement that women weren't given the same opportunities in education, upper education, like men were. So the same women who were engaged in social work, client casework, social reform, were also on committees and societies which were pushing for the development of female education institutions. So you saw at this time the creation of like a design school, an art school, of women's medical college. And so the goal of these institutions was to be sort of facilitated by wealthy men, with the goal of having women take them over. And almost immediately, women took them over. So they appointed women doctors or, women designers to instruct and lead these organizations. And women became deans, not too long afterwards. So we see lots of examples of this taking place in the 19th century in Philadelphia, at least. In the traditional social work history, though, in the sort of period of 1870s to like 1930s, we do see women heavily involved. They're very highly educated women. So they're women who would have otherwise been doctors. And that's literally how they described it at the time. They justified the development of these master's programs for social workers as an alternative to medicine for women who weren't allowed into those universities, that this was an outlet for really smart women who needed something to do and needed to use their brain. And the psychiatrists who supported the development of these programs were constantly saying this, like, women should be in charge of social work. And it happened institutionally as well. You would see women lead social work departments that were starting, at least white women in the North. The other part of that question was about headmasters. I think of women in school education, so teaching children. And we owe the start of our profession really to that process. There was a shift in the 19th century where school teachers became women. So they started off as men, but men moved into university education and women took over the school education. And this happened in not just America. So we see this in England and in other countries, that the role of a school teacher in this time when women took over became associated with a lot of different social services for children and youth, as more and more parents moved into work, into industrial work, and were unable to care for children in that sort of way. So the start of a lot of these social work practices and tasks took place within teaching. And hence you see throughout those hundreds of years, especially with Black women, they moved from teaching to social work and back and forth throughout the period, very much intertwined. So women's leadership in education and social work is very much the same history.
Thank you. We have one further question. Were Black settlements officially accepted in the same way than churches or white settlement?
Another great question. Joyce Bell addresses this in her book. So she focuses on sort of an uprising within the settlement federation about from Black settlement houses or Black workers within the settlement movement, and how their strategies look different than the Black social workers who organized within the National Association of Social Work. And so the strategies for their sort of Black Power movement within settlement was more compromising. They negotiated and educated their white colleagues and secured a voice that they were satisfied with at the time. And so they sort of stayed as a part of the Settlement Federation more integrated way than what happened with the National Association, which split and had a National Association of Black Social Workers. And that organization served as the primary organizing for Black social workers within what's more traditionally casework, social work. The treatment of Black settlement houses, though, as opposed to sort of Black workers within the settlement movement, was highly segregated, like intensely segregated. And the start, they would serve mixed group, but because of the increase in racial segregation and racial prejudice, they forced to create separate organizations. And oftentimes in certain cities, they would operate two different organizations. It would be the same people leading them. So a lot of the Black settlement houses in specific northern cities were actually run by white people and not as effective as the Black missions, which were taken over in some parts by Black people who really had a stronger role in the organization of services. Part of that, the historians describe as down to funding. That funding forced people into this situation. I'm not compelled by that evidence. Other scholars I've seen, particularly those writing from more of a Black history perspective, have shown some really compelling evidence, which seems embedded in the history of the Black church movement or the Black mission movement. And so we see with the Free African Society, for example, how they split from white church and for what reasons they did, and how they serve their communities differently, and how that segregation was almost an interest convergence between the white community, who was kind of happy to not have Black people threatening their perceived safety, and not to feel fiscally responsible, and then the Black church and the Black mission works, which were intended to support themselves eventually. And that theory, that goal, that objective lasted throughout the 20th century, into the 20th century and beyond. We see it through lots of evidence produced, for example, during the civil rights movement, where the government said, this is a problem, it's due to racism, but whose responsibility is it to fix? And always it's been forced back onto the Black community, which has had some significant leaders or pioneers that sort of helped to keep things afloat. James Forten, for example, in the 19th century, he was the richest shipbuilder in Philadelphia. He died like almost penniless because he gave away so much of his money to uplift the Black community in Philadelphia. You don't see white philanthropists doing that. Like they don't die penniless. They try to hoard as much as they can. So I hope that sort of addresses some of the questions around the Black settlement use. For me, what I'm saying is that if you rely just on the traditional white history of settlement houses, you may not see the same history. If you start to look at the Black mission movement, you see a different perspective of the settlement movement and how it might look like from the perspective of Black people living during those times.
Thank you very much. I think time is a little bit running out. Maybe you can have a little bit of water, and I will ask the student which question is the most important to have two last ones. Yes, I just have a chit chat with my students. Okay, last two questions. Ooh.
I'll try to be short.
Yeah. Would you say that the massive amount of social engagement was based on the situation and the difficult situation of Black women? Did you understand?
I'm not quite sure. I understand what they mean by social engagement in this case, because that could mean separate things.
Okay, it's my pronunciation. Would you say that the massive amount of social engagement or social
empowerment, encouragement?
Yeah, so was based on the situation and the difficult situation of Black women. So was it because their living conditions were very bad that they were so much involved in social work? Is this the question? Yeah. Was it necessary because of the situation?
I think, we learn as social workers, there's a human drive for survival. We all want to be comfortable and safe. And a lot of our behaviors and our choices are shaped around that dilemma. How can we, in this time and place, be safe? What I see in the archives in both white women and Black women in the 19th century is they are heavily motivated by seeing their peers suffer. So they both have deep empathy for other women and children who are helpless or made helpless, or in Pinderhugh's words, made powerless by structures that were meant to support them. So as free people in particular, and I'm going to speak to free people, free Black people, like technically Philadelphia had pretty less racist laws than other states. But the social interactions and the institutional structures still were incredibly oppressive and racist. There were a lot of riots by white people regarding the presence of Black people in these spaces. And you see the map of where Black people lived get pushed further and further out of the city as sort of white people took over and excluded Black people from their lives. And so I can only imagine the factors that impacted their desire to survive and thrive. It was happening regardless of race. It's something that they saw themselves as a universal struggle. And so that's why they collaborated together. They recognized that race was a specific dynamic, a significant factor in the work that they did, and it shaped the way they delivered services. So you see a lot more mutual aid, a lot more collective support, a lot more focus on community building, and sort of a sharing of that in the Black community. But we see it in a number of white institutions in that same period. I'm not progressed to a point where I could say one caused the other, so I can't answer your question. Did Black women engage in this sort of work because of their oppression? I like to think that they have brought with them just this internalized sense of their own culture and the culture they wanted to have. And that regardless of their level of oppression, because many of the women I described to you were incredibly wealthy, wealthier than me, for sure, way more comfortable. They didn't need to work. They did it anyway. And so that culture, I think, was what contributed significantly to their choices, as much as the oppression.
Okay, last question, and it's about social work today, and it's covering the welfare state. And the students want to know, how is social work financed today in the USA? Is it still charity or community work, or how does it work?
Well, we've shifted a bit backwards from the World War period I was describing, or at least the early part of the 20th century. We don't have universal health care. We have a lot of federally funded subsidies, so grants that are provided to states, which are then distributed to agencies, so private nonprofit organizations who offer social work services. There are still state-run ones. So the Veterans Administration, which is a state-run hospital, the Medicaid funding, so that is all state funded. But the vast majority of social work is actually employed through private nonprofit organizations. And I don't have it with me, but in another presentation, I have this beautiful visual, which shows how much money like moves through charities and foundations. Most of it goes to hospitals, is the short end of it. So you do see a focus on social work, behavioral health, or medical that comes out of hospital nonprofits or around medical or that sort of provision of services. I would say that the amount of funding from smaller foundations is a negligible part. So you have the government, then you have hospitals, and then smaller funds of charity. And then the practice of social work, a big part of it is the clinical social work. So licensed social workers like myself who take tests and are approved by the state to provide specific therapeutic services, evidence-based, which look more like your traditional psychotherapy. But in practice, it doesn't always look like that. And the more and more we're seeing people hiring for non-clinical workers in clinical settings. So more of a community building or a public health perspective, where they're not trained in social work like you or I are, but instead developing more more relational skills to encourage people to engage in the services that exist. Funding is incredibly limited, and because it's a feminized profession, it's incredibly underpaid. So you'll see master's level social workers making anywhere between 40 and 50K in large cities, which is significantly below living wages, and not comparable to more masculine traditional professions.
Thank you, Katherine. It was a wonderful talk. It was amazing and inspiring, and I think it's so important, the story you are telling us. And I think it's maybe also a starting point to reflecting how we are telling our history. So thank you that you were with us. Hopefully see you another time.
Now I'm excited for the rest of your talks.
Yeah.
Deservingness is a really good segue from here.
Yes,
So.
maybe we see you in the virtual space next week with Joellen, and yeah, greetings to Cleveland from Stuttgart, and bye. Stop recording now.
Ciao.